Columbia, I've seen your mountains high, seen your pretty rainbows and your blue crystal skies, watched your winding rivers as they flow around the bend. To me, you're not a stranger, you'll always be a friend.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is August 2nd, 2018, and this is episode 97. Politicos is the BC Politics Podcast. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and leave a review wherever you found us. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, where we're at PoliticosPod, and support the show at patreon.com/politicos.
I'm Scott Glenboom.
And I'm Ehim Bushfield. On today's show, we're joined by Fair Vote Canada, BC, on-the-ground organizer, Keith Poore. Welcome to Politicos.
Thank you.
Or welcome back.
Yeah, this would be the second time I've been on here.
We're going to talk with you, Keith, about proportional representation, obviously, with the referendum coming up. I think we dove into dual-member proportional a couple weeks ago, and we're going to break down today mixed-member proportional, rural-urban proportional, and just the system at large as it's going forward. First, though, we have to thank our premier sponsors, Lindsay Teds and Blake Hodson, for helping make the show possible. Politicos is in partnership with BC Today, British Columbia's daily newsletter dedicated exclusively to BC politics. Sign up for a free 2-week trial to have unique coverage of the BC legislature delivered to your inbox every morning. Listeners, enter the offer code CITIZEN for access to a special rate just for you. For your free 2-week trial, go to britishcolumbiatoday.ca. And before we jump into our discussion, 2 quick housekeeping notes. First up, live show for the 100th episode coming up soon. We don't have it planned yet, but I think we've decided to do Vancouver just because it's easier for us. But we will be in Victoria at some point in the fall, perhaps when all the politicians are there. So we will put details as soon as we have confirmed what's happening for our 100th on our Patreon, and then we'll release that publicly shortly after. So if you want to be the first to know, patreon.com/politicos. Second up, we don't know anything about shipbuilding, it turns out.
Yeah, we got a little bit of feedback on our conversation last week. Got an email from William suggesting that we talk to a couple of the naval architects in the town and research hybrid electric vessels.
Apparently they're pretty common, work very well. He tells us there's no charging cycle as the charge comes from diesel still, so it's just more efficient. It's like a
which
a
makes
hybrid.
sense. Like I know a bunch of the Navy ships run on diesel electric power, so stick a battery pack in there makes sense.
Also, a lot of people really went to bat for Port Alberni as a shipbuilding facility. First, there was a slip of the tongue. I said wet dock when I meant dry dock, but I grew up on the prairie, so I have an excuse.
Not very familiar with just docks as a general concept.
Yeah, there were a couple on lakes, but we didn't even have that good of lakes. Port Alberni still seems a bit weird to me because it's not that central and the road to it is not that big. Like, it's a nice town, but in terms of giant manufacturing facilities.
Yeah, it's a 2-lane highway through the mountains to get there. Like, a lawn trip by water around half of Vancouver Island. Like, it's not where most of the ships are.
But I'm in favor of this idea of getting a naval architect or some person who knows more about shipbuilding policy on the show. So if that's you, email us, podcast@politicos.ca. Let's jump into our only segment for today. What the hell is going on with proportional representation? Keith, why don't you just start by giving us a little bit of background on what you're doing with Fair Vote Canada and what their role is in this referendum?
Sure. So Fair Vote Canada has a provincial chapter, which is Fair Vote Canada BC. You can follow them on Twitter, Fair Vote BC. And we are trying to just talk to as many people as we can about proportional representation. So we have teams on the ground that are going out door knocking. They are going to farmers markets and we're trying to identify our supporters. And we're also kind of getting people up to speed on the fact that we're even having a referendum. People are currently relatively oblivious. So when we go to the door and say, did you know we're actually having a referendum? Most people are saying, what? What's this referendum about? So we're getting people up to speed, one door at a time, one farmer's market at a time.
And so you're not with the official Yes PR BC campaign. It is a third-party advertiser.
Correct. We are third-party advertiser. We had a amicable kind of breakup in a way. We still believe that they're doing a great job. We're not allowed to coordinate with them, and they're not allowed to coordinate with us. We're a separate entity.
But still have the same goals, correct?
Oh, absolutely. We've counted about 6 or 7 proponent groups that are either the official proponent or a political party that's in favor or a third-party advertiser that's in favor. So Lead Now and Dogwood, for example.
So on the referendum itself, the ballot is a two-part question. Let's just run through that again. We've talked about it a few times on the pod, but just assuming this is the first proportional representation podcast they're listening to.
Yeah, absolutely. And we actually bring to the door once in a while a sample of the ballot. The first question, very simple. For the provincial elections, do you want to keep the current system or move to a proportional voting system? And that's what we're encouraging people to consider. After that, you have three options. You get to rank your ballot on the three proportional voting systems that are being proposed, which are dual member proportional, mixed member proportional, and rural urban proportional. We aren't advocating for any of the three systems. We are only pushing for the change to proportional representation.
And why is that?
We believe that any of the systems that are proportional are much better than what we currently have. We don't get the various flaws that first past the post creates.
I know when the government was looking at doing a referendum and they had a consultation period and it was fairly short because it's a minority parliament that could fall apart tomorrow in theory, but not reality. Fair Vote Canada put forward a number of recommendations to that. Was this two-part question one of those recommendations, as far as you know?
If I can recall, we did recommend the two-part question. I don't fully understand the rationale behind it. I think part of it was we wanted a very simple question. Can we move to a proportional system or keep the current system? But we also kind of looked at what PEI did, and they were successful in voting for a proportional voting system. And they used a ranked ballot to determine the different systems that would be possible in PEI. And so looking at the result there, we did ask for a ranked ballot in terms of the different systems.
Well, let's move on to the systems and start with mixed member proportional. Do you go through the basics of what that system is?
So if I remember David Eby's report correctly, boundaries would increase a little bit by about 40%, giving us the flexibility of having regional or provincial lists for electing a regional top-up. So you'd still run the first past the post in a riding, but you'd also have a second X to put under either a party list or a list of candidates that are essentially party nominees. So there is a difference here. There is a closed list system and an open list system. These are options that the government and all party committee would be determining. We will be advocating, if we get this system, to move to an open list system so then candidates are more accountable.
But there isn't a way for the voters to actually express a preference for open or closed lists.
Not currently. Unfortunately, that process is not open to discussion right now.
The disadvantage of an open list system, though, is you can end up with this ballot that, has 6 candidates per party, say, if it's a region that has 6 top-up seats. Times that by, 3 to 4 parties, and you're up to, 20 or 30 names. And any voter in Vancouver knows how difficult it can get to parse a long list of candidates when perhaps just saying, I like the NDP or I like the BC Conservatives or whatever might be a little bit easier. So do you see that challenge being real or outweighing?
To an extent. I believe that voters like choice. They like to have options, and they don't want to have this mystical party come up with a magic formula to select who they should be putting forward on the ballot and who they should be selecting should they get enough seats. I think voters want to know who they're electing. So if candidate A is on the top of the list, but they're not popular, and voter Joe or Jane wants to vote for candidate C, but that person's third on the list, that is going to be expressed to that party saying this is the way the party should be going. So if there's a more progressive candidate on the list and that is the more popular choice by the voter, that's the way to go. Similarly, if there's a more conservative candidate on the list and the more liberal or more centrist candidate is at the top, but the voter wants a more conservative voice, the party will then understand, oh, we need to start having a bit of a more conservative voice.
So would the open list be a ranked ballot, or would it just be a check one?
It would be a check one.
And so I think when I think about that, that risks a sort of vote splitting in the way that like Vancouver's by-election had such a long list, and you can get
Yeah, absolutely.
a split where, say, all the NDP voters divide evenly among their 5 candidates and all the Liberals focus on 2.
Yeah, exactly. So it could cause a split within the party, but it does force the party to listen to the voter and listen to what direction that party should be going in the future.
And do you think you'll see something similar to here where parties strategize about how many people to run, or would they actually have to just fill the full seats or whatever the number is?
It doesn't make sense, at least to me, if a party runs a full slate, knowing that they probably can't achieve that full slate to getting in. They could be better using that resources to get the 2 or 3 that they could get in. But that is a political calculus that a political party has to decide, and not the average voter.
And so you mentioned the ridings increase in size with MMP. I think the advantage over like dual member proportional that we talked about a couple weeks ago is we're not literally doubling it in most cases. But as Sean Graham talked about, we can set aside a couple of the large ridings and just say those are just single member constituencies. Under this system, though, do we kind of water down some rural representation by expanding the local ridings?
So in the AG's report, he said the largest of ridings won't be touched. They won't see an increase in the number of constituents that MLA needs to serve or would serve. So those boundaries are going to be pretty much the same. And it's really up to the Independent Boundary Commission to come up with the new map. It's not up to the AG. It's not a partisan hack that's doing this. It would be a very independent process.
Sometimes the rural areas are already kind of overrepresented on a per person basis. No, that's true in Canada. I'm not quite sure how much in BC, but is there a concern that if you're keeping the large ridings the same and then increasing the size of the smaller ones, you could skew that even more?
So the ratio of constituent to MLA shouldn't change a whole lot. We are going to the AG recommended that there be no more than 8 new MLAs. So the ratio may decrease in urban areas and stay relatively the same here, or it might increase. I don't think in a rural area it'll increase.
One of the concerns I've heard from people about MMP is these lists, regional MLAs, whether they're elected from an open or a closed list, don't really have constituents to be responsible to. Like, who do they go on the barbecue circuit to? Who do they, where is their constituency office in that case? What's the sort of response to that?
In my mind, if they want to be reelected, especially under an open list system, they're going to have to go to even more of the barbecues than the MLAs currently host. So this weekend, my MLA out in Burnaby Edmonds is co-hosting the Burnaby New West MP at a barbecue under a open list system where you have regional representation as well. And that regional MLA will probably go to a few of the barbecues that are being co-hosted by one of their co-patriots, their fellow MLA.
I mean, that question came from Twitter, and I kind of wanted to respond pointing out there are a lot of MLAs who don't go to barbecues right now, but I think it's something worth thinking more about. MMP, I think, is one of the most tested of the 3 systems on the ballot. The other 2 are more sort of theoretical and have, like Sean says, done simulations on, but we haven't really seen them in practice. Could you talk about the countries that are using MMP and how it's worked out for them?
Sure. So we have New Zealand, Germany, we have Scotland that uses MMP. I'm sure there are a few others, but those are the examples I usually talk about.
And so New Zealand, I think, is probably the best example to think about because it's a Commonwealth country. I mean, BC's province in a Commonwealth country,
So-
but New Zealand switched over very recently as well.
Right. So you can think about New Zealand because it is a Commonwealth country, but Scotland as well, because it's a subpopulation within a greater nation, the UK versus Scotland. So both examples, they're doing quite well. Their economy is thriving, or at least relatively well. I don't hear any negativity coming from either of these countries.
They have had potentially more coalition governments since.
But coalition isn't a bad thing. I remember growing up and first getting politically active and Stephen Harper, downplaying or dismaying coalitions. But what's the problem with working together? I have to work with other people to get stuff done at work. I'm sure everyone else does too.
It's when you bring the socialists and the separatists in that it kind of
The
ruins
separatists that really killed that one.
How has New Zealand felt? Like, I know the country held a referendum, but they also held a follow-up referendum. Did it go well there? Have they seemed to have enjoyed the new system?
Yeah, so they did have a follow-up referendum as to whether to keep MMP or not, and they decided to keep MMP. They got familiar with it. The politicians learned how to play within the new setting, and there's been a lot more cooperation. And there's been better diversity in their parliament. I believe there's 5 Indigenous politicians, so they have some Maori MPs. How great would it be to have more Indigenous MLAs here in British Columbia?
I'm for it.
Well, one thing that stands out to me on all of those countries is they're all fairly small. Like, I think you could probably fit all 3 of them inside BC. Is there any concerns that on a larger geographic scale it gets trickier?
Like, in terms of, I think, the sparsity. So Germany, I think, is a bigger country, but it's fairly dense. And
Yeah, it's
the
like
population
60
live
million
everywhere.
people, but like, small, fairly compact area relative.
So I think when David Eby said we're not going to expand the boundaries of the very largest ridings, I think that kind of mitigated that idea that, rural areas are going to be underserved, the ratio is going to be messed with, and their voices will no longer be heard. By preserving those boundaries, I think MMP would work well. I think any issues that rural citizens have will still be addressed by a local MLA.
Well, let's switch from mixed member proportional to this rural-urban proportional representation system, the hybrid. So part of it is MMP, like we've just talked about, and the other half is single transferable vote in the major urban centers. Maybe just remind people who didn't pay attention during the last 2 referendums what STV is.
So STV would look like this, where we'd amalgamate multiple ridings into one big riding, and we'd have just as many MLAs representing that region or that area. So Burnaby and New West have 5 ridings. That could become one riding, represented still by 5 MLAs, but the ballot's going to be a bit different. You get to rank your ballot. You get to say, I want candidate A first, I want candidate Z second, candidate G third, and so forth. You get to rank your ballot, you get more choice, and it turns out you actually elect more independents as well. So the gist is that everyone, or mostly everyone's represented by either their first, second, or third preference.
And there's a formula that we don't need to go into that sort of calculates that, but
You don't want to find out, Fair Vote, Canada's position on hair versus droop?
I'm not going there.
we'll link probably some CGP Grey video that I think explains.
There
some
is
of the count.
exactly. That's where I learned it from.
Yeah.
Which we'll link in the show notes.
So what are the major dividing lines? So you have STV in the urban areas and MMP in the rural. What counts as urban as far as we can tell so far?
So it was said that it'd be urban and semi-urban areas would use STV. What that looks like to me currently is not very clear. Kamloops, for example, that could be considered semi-urban. If that's the case, they have 2 ridings that become one and elect 2 members. So we obviously know that Metro Vancouver would become multi-member ridings, multiple multi-member ridings. Outside of Metro Vancouver, I think there's some details that are still to be expected.
So what's the motivation for this system, though? Why would we want to have essentially 2 electoral systems in the province?
That's a fair question, and the answer is I traveled on a SkyTrain for 30 minutes. I cross 6 ridings. I can travel to, as someone who lives in an urban area, I can travel to any one of my neighboring ridings within 10 minutes. So I could see my MLA or any MLA in adjacent ridings within 20 minutes. That situation is not true in rural areas. You can travel for 20 minutes, an hour, and still not leave your own riding.
You can travel like 3-4 hours up north and still not leave your riding.
Exactly. So why would one system that works in an urban area still be true in another area? I think to provide a better proportional system, you could use two systems within different settings. This was explained by Jean-Pierre Kingsley during the federal consultation around electoral reform. He hypothesized that we could use STV in urban areas and semi-urban areas, and we could use MMP in rural areas, and we would have a proportional voting system. In the rural areas, those boundaries won't expand a whole lot, but they can expand or be amalgamated in urban areas because of the convenience of being able to travel across riding boundaries so quickly.
Is there not any concern of basically creating two classes of electors?
No, I don't think so. You're still going to have local MLAs. And in 1991, we actually moved to only single-member ridings. Previous to that, we had multi-member ridings in different areas of this province. So why not move back?
Well, and even historically, I know for a fact, Alberta, for a long time, or at least a couple elections, Calgary and Edmonton were both switched to STV systems within their boundaries, and then the rest of the province was just first past the post.
I think federally at one point, Halifax sent 2 MPs from the same one large riding.
Yeah. Well, and you can do multi-member ridings that aren't STV, where it could be dual member, like we talked about, but no one's done that. But, a first past the post where you just check one, and then it's sort of like Vancouver, I guess. Or I guess you check 2.
First couple past the post.
Yeah.
Why is mixed member proportional the other system rather than, say, an instant runoff, which would keep the ballot basically identical except for the number of people on it?
I mean, you can do that, but mixed member proportional still keeps or preserves proportionality in rural areas. A majoritarian system like AV, alternative voting, would not preserve the proportionality. I mean, we can do top-ups in rural areas, but we ultimately want to have proportionality throughout all of BC.
Is there a risk that this system and the unknowns around it, like what cities count as semi-urban and which don't, might just have too many unknowns and end up being too complicated for people? Like if you move from, Fort St. John, which will probably undoubtedly be in the MMP area, to Vancouver, and suddenly your ballot's different, is that a knock against it?
If we're already able to switch from one mindset of a voting system to another, and then once we've made that switch, you move, you are programmed to understand how to think differently about our voting system. I don't think if you move from Fort St. John to Vancouver, you're experiencing something new that you're going to be put off. I just don't think so.
I guess one of the other criticisms people could lay is BC did vote on STV twice and reject it. So why would we want to bring that losing system, as it were, into our provincial voting mix?
As it turns out, urban areas actually supported STV quite resoundingly. In the first referendum, all of Metro Vancouver, except I think Richmond, voted for STV. Even in the second referendum, Vancouver thought it was still a viable option. So why not allow urban areas to move to that system, which they voted twice on in favor of, and let rural areas vote on a different voting system, or, having their rural urban?
Well, let's move on to some broader, overarching questions. We have these 3 systems. Do you have a sense of kind of where they came from? Obviously, no one except David Eby and a few of his advisors actually know why they picked these, but why put these 3 and not include STV or include any other number of ways of electing MPs?
Well, I think David Eby had to make a very short list. He could put one against first past the post, or he could put multiple against first past the post, as they did in PEI. Dual member proportional was, I think, relatively popular in PEI. It didn't make the final cut, but I think it made it to the third round.
Yeah, I think the worst one was just like first past the post plus leaders or something, and so it beat some of those like, is this really a change kind of systems?
But yeah, exactly. This one has been put up against the voters, and voters thought it was a decent change. I think David Eby saw that and said, maybe that'll work here. MMP, I think, is a classical version of PR that a lot of people tend towards. It's also federally, the NDP are in favor of MMP. Since those two, the provincial and the federal, are relatively closely linked, I believe that they kind of had to put MMP on as an option. In terms of rural-urban proportional, I was actually a little surprised. I actually thought the local PR voting system was going to be put up because that was another Made in Canada solution that kind of arose from the federal process.
And what system's that?
It's similar to STV, except you keep local boundaries, but you're able to rank your adjacent ridings as well. So it's essentially STV, but you preserve your riding.
Huh.
I think STV in its purest form wasn't selected because it's gone through 2 referenda before and was determined not to be suitable for all of BC.
So how would independence fit into these systems?
So under MMP, you'd probably see the same number as independents as we currently see, so very few. You get the odd one once in a while or every election cycle, but you wouldn't see too many. In Ireland, which uses STV, they see a lot of independents get elected. So if we move to rural-urban proportional, you would likely see an increase in independents getting elected. And then under dual-member proportional, it's relatively hard to say because of that threshold that's imposed. If they come first or second, they get elected.
Well, just more broadly, maybe, one of the questions that people are probably thinking about is they see this 2-part question and maybe they have a strong feeling about the first question. But if they kind of look at these 3 alternatives and say, well, they all claim to result in a pretty proportional outcome. Some have slightly different, the ballot will be slightly different depending on which we go, but why should I care about the second part when, if they all deliver the same result?
So there are slight nuances in each of these systems, and that's why we're asking which of these 3 do you prefer and rank your ballot. I like to think that RUP, the rural urban, provides more choice for voters, especially in urban areas. Under MMP, it's the most familiar across the globe, and dual member proportional, it's the simplest ballot. The ballot's not going to really change. You might see an extra name under a party's list or under a party's name, but otherwise you're still putting 1X. So it depends on what voters actually value. If they value choice, they're probably going to vote for RUP. If they value something that's familiar across the world, they're going to vote MMP. If they want to keep the ballot as simple as possible, they're probably going to choose DMP as their first preference.
Do any of these systems in your mind pose the risk that the No campaign pushes around about extremist parties? Like most of them will result in probably a couple more parties at least being represented in the legislature. Will we see the Christian Heritage Party or even further right parties get elected, or like the communists and even further left? And should we be worried about that, especially in the age of Trump?
Right. Well, in the age of Trump, anything can happen. Even Trump can get elected. That being said, I don't think there's as much to worry about. You don't typically see, we're not going to see a whole lot of parties getting in. You might see all of a sudden a couple BC conservatives getting in. But any of the other parties that are listed on Elections BC's website probably won't get in. They probably won't even earn a seat. And there is a threshold in which regionally or provincially a party can get a seat under a list system such as RUP or MMP. that if they do not get 5% of the vote, they won't get a seat.
So this isn't going to be the Excalibur's party's big break?
No, I don't think so. And in the last election, combining all of the other parties, all the fringe parties, if you will, their totals didn't come up to 1%. Of course, moving to a voting system that is different, you might get a different result.
So let's say the referendum passes. What's the next step? How does the vote turn into an actual change in the system?
So it's my understanding that there will be an all-party committee determining certain things like a closed or open list system, and we're obviously going to be advocating for an open list system because we want our MLAs accountable. There are other nuances in each of the systems that need to be determined, and that all-party committee will determine that. There's also the Boundaries Commission, which will determine, where will the new boundaries exist, or where's the dividing line. That's not done by the parties, it's done by an independent commission, and they are the ones who will say, oh, this new Vancouver, Granville, and West End and False Creek riding starts here, ends here, and here are the boundaries.
How long will that take?
So I believe, again, the AG said that we wouldn't be implementing the PR system until the next proper appropriate election, which would be 4 years from the last one.
Okay, so if the Greens decide to take down the NDP over fish farms or something, 2 months after the vote, things could get a little tricky.
Things would get quite tricky.
And then, assuming that doesn't happen, if the government survives to 2021, we have the first election under one of these three systems. There's a follow-up election.
So we're going to have two.
There's a follow-up
cycles.
referendum.
Yeah, so we're going to have 2 election cycles to try this out. And so one of my friends, who is also pro PR and very much enjoys canvassing, why not go radical and try one of these systems that haven't been used in other countries? We get to vote on whether we want to keep it or not in 2 election cycles. So why not move to something that could potentially be so much better than something that's already been tried elsewhere? And, we get to vote on it again.
Is there a risk, though, with the radical idea that you kind of scare British Columbians off PR for another generation?
There is that risk, absolutely. I would be remiss if I said this is our last chance for our generation. I'm 28. I'm probably not going to see another referendum like this in my lifetime.
Although for many British Columbians, it's a third referendum in their lifetime, so apparently they're not that rare here. But
British Columbians are a bit weirder than the rest of Canada in terms of going through this process. Ontario's gone through it. There are rumblings that a movement might start for another PR referendum, but
probably not with the current government.
Not at all.
Well, all the Quebec parties except the Liberals have pledged to just make it happen, and PEI's got its... Well, it doesn't know where it is because they didn't have enough people vote, so they didn't feel it was legitimate, which I guess raises a question for BC. What happens if 5% of British Columbians or fewer vote in this ballot?
Then we made a decision with 5% of voters. The big thing about democracy is you get to choose whether you want to participate. If you decide that you don't want to participate and you want to let other people decide for you, you've made that democratic choice.
So Fair Vote isn't pushing for the adoption of the Australian model?
No, not at all.
One question I sort of have going back to the different models, if we look at these 3 different ones, is there any one that looks more complicated to implement or more expensive to implement than the others, or which is the easiest? We could probably turn that around in a week.
I would think that DMP would be the easiest to turn around within a week. You're just amalgamating 2 ridings. You can keep the existing, outside borders and just remove the boundary line there. RUP would probably be more expensive to implement just because you are dealing with 2 different types of ballots. You're using MMP one place, STV a different place. So you have to essentially get a Scantron machine for STV if you want to do this within one night.
Is there anything we didn't get to on either any of the systems or proportional representation writ large in this province that you sort of wanted to highlight?
I do want to point out that Denmark and Iceland actually use something similar to rural-urban proportional, where denser areas have multi-member systems, list systems, and then in the rest of the country, they have regional list systems as well. And so they have this idea that denser or more populous areas have different needs and would be better served by a slightly different voting system than other parts of that country.
When you said Iceland, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and they elected pirates and kicked out all the banks.
Yeah, great.
They faced a number of other financial issues too that kind of precipitated all of that. But it's interesting looking around the world at how few countries maintain first past the post. And kind of every democracy started after like 1900 is like, no, we're not going to use that system. Right. And it's just weird that we kind of get stuck with what, the first fledgling efforts at democracy in the UK did in like the 17th century. We're like, oh, we'll keep that thing. That seems well thought through. Up
until recently, we were the only country in the world, I believe, that used first past the post on every level of government. The U.S. has some municipalities that use a ranked ballot. I believe that's true for the U.K. as well, though
they might be getting it because Scotland might count for them.
Yeah.
Like I know San Francisco does runoff voting.
But now London, Ontario is using a ranked ballot, so we're no longer the exclusive first past the post users.
Well, if people want to get more involved or want to learn more about Fair Vote Canada or just more about proportional representation in general, where should they be going on the internet?
We have two websites, one for all of BC and one more locally in Vancouver and Metro Vancouver. So fairvote.ca/PR4BC. So the number 4 BC. And locally, if you want to get involved, you can go to fairvotevancouver.ca. You'll get redirected to makeeveryvotecount.ca. We have both domains. And we have volunteer sign-up sheets. We have a donate button. We have an event calendar that lists where we're going to be at for pretty much every day. We go out canvassing 6 days a week.
And people should be getting their ballots in the mail sometime in October.
Around October 22nd, that's when it gets released. So, within 4 days, I would expect most people, 90% of people, would have their ballots.
And where can people follow you if they want to learn more?
I'm on Twitter at Keith Poore. That's KEITHPOORE.
Well, moving on to our quick takes, and feel free to chime in, Keith, if you have opinions, and those are not the official opinions of Fair Vote Canada.
I sure hope not.
Or maybe they are, but we're just not going to tie them to them. First up, I want to talk about this Seniors Advocate report that came out today. BC, I don't actually know how long this position has been around, but a advocate has been appointed for seniors in the province to make sure that the residential care homes that many live in are well maintained and the people who are in them have a voice, because we often forget about the elderly. It's especially if they're put in a care home, it's kind of not seen, not heard, not thought about, and you just kind of let it go. But they are human beings who are an element of our society, and so it's valuable to have a sort of ombudsman who can raise the alarm. And raise the alarm they have, as a new report kind of damns contracted private care homes. So BC splits our industry of care homes into both the publicly funded and ones that are funded by the government. Then you have your fully private luxury ones, which I think there's actually one just next door here. But many of the, government funded ones are actually run by private third parties. Actually, it turns out 2/3 of the ones that are subsidized are run by private authorities versus the rest are done by the regional health authorities. So for the study, they looked at 212 of the 293 subsidized care homes. 75% of those were run by contract. And it turns out if you are in one of those private care homes, you are more likely to go to hospital, stay in hospital longer, when you come out of hospital, go to a different facility, which is,
That seems weird.
yeah, not cool. Imagine, I break my leg here in my condo. I go to hospital and I leave and they're like, no, you can't actually go home. You're going to a new place. It's just not cool. And I think most worrying of all is you're 54% more likely to die in the hospital if you come from a private care home. So it's not great news. And the advocate points out that if the contracted facilities were doing as well as the public facilities, we would save $16 million on healthcare costs because people wouldn't be going to hospital as long or as often or for as serious of issues because they'd have been cared for properly in the first place. This would also free up 15,500 hospital beds a year and just generally have seniors living healthier. The speculation is that we don't know exactly why private care homes are doing worse than public ones. The speculation is there's high staff turnover, they're maybe not hiring the most qualified people or not the most experienced because they're paying a bit less, cutting corners, that kind of thing. And it really just goes to show why the market sometimes doesn't really make the best answer when maybe we should just nationalize them all and turn them into public healthcare facilities.
Yeah, it's often these sorts of situations where the government is paying to contract something out tend not to be the situations where market forces work particularly well, mostly because it tends to be a very limited pool and, contracts are super competitive in a lot of ways.
I can actually speak about some of the employment issues because I did some consulting work with a hospice, and a lot of the staff there, the nurses and even the doctors, were getting older. Within 20 years, they're all going to retire. They might be down to one person, one or two people still on as the original staff. And they're having a hard time recruiting younger people to come in. So people who were students the previous year, just recent graduates, they're having a really tough time just recruiting new talent.
So there's no quick and easy solution to this. I joke about nationalizing them all, but that's
I think
difficult.
It's difficult, and we should probably figure out where the differences are coming from before we jump to this will be the solution step.
And they're not giant numbers. So when I talk about more people going to ER and being hospitalized, it's about 30% more people coming from the private facilities than the public. So it could even be a situation where there are some really bad private ones and there are some all right ones that are on average, and there are probably some that are better. So if we can have some better enforcement of the regulations or put better regulations in, we can at least clamp down on those that are misbehaving and probably bring those numbers up. Or do like Vancouver is, expropriate the Sahota properties of the residential care facility industry and just by pure statistics improve their numbers. But when I got this update on BC Today, she didn't actually have comment from the provincial government yet, which was a bit surprising. I guess they're kind of mulling over the report and deciding where they could go. Although being only a year into government, the easy answer is to always just blame the last guys because that's what they've done on everything else.
Yeah, and what governments tend to do until they're in the third or fourth term.
And even then, but...
Oh yeah, we still heard about how terrible Mike Harris was as Premier Wynne was going out the door.
We were still hearing how bad the NDP was in the 2017 election. From the
That's
previous...
actually roughly about the same amount of time.
Yeah. So this will be a file to watch because this is one of those touchy, tricky issues, but it's one that also gets forgotten about and I think ignored. So hopefully some smart moves come in the fall that look to both, save people's lives and reduce healthcare costs, which all seem like noble aspirations, especially for a government that claims to care about those kind of things.
I think all governments claim to care about those sorts of things.
Sure.
But something else that parties tend to care about, especially if their emails are any indication, is fundraising. And we got some latest numbers out of the Elections BC reports. And turns out the NDP is doing pretty well for themselves.
Yeah, the interim financial reports are out for January to June 30th, 2018. And this is an interesting period to look at because the new election financing rules, some of them came into play partway through this. some were retroactive. It's all very messy. But the top line numbers are that the NDP are very happy and everyone else is kind of struggling along. So the BC NDP raised $1.26 million, which is almost double the $748,000 the BC Liberals raised, and the Green Party pulled in $271,000.
Just actually probably the best in terms of money coming in per seat. They're probably doing better than a party that size should, relative.
But for the Liberals, I think this is mostly bad news because in previous quarters or previous fiscal periods, I guess this is a half a year, the Liberals could pull like $6+ million, especially in an election year, and always double the NDP. But now having to rely on those individual donors of up to $1,200, it seems like they've kind of lost some ground. I mean, they had a leadership race in there, but that should have also spurred a bit of fundraising. I mean, the race was
most
closing.
of the most of the fundraising will have happened, and but yeah, they should have still gotten a boost from that. Especially, actually, I can't remember if the party took a cut of the fundraising. I think they did. But yeah, regardless, this isn't great news for them, and part of it is that money tends to follow power, and part of it too is the Liberals haven't been exactly in their stride, and a little bit is they've some of the more experienced hands left after they lost power.
And I don't have the numbers in front of us, but I know the federal numbers were out as well, and they were pretty good news for the Conservatives, I believe. The Liberals were doing okay, but a bit behind them, and the NDP was almost like nowhere to be found. Like they were almost on par with like the federal Greens in terms of fundraising. Yeah. I mean, the Bloc didn't exist. They had like 600 donors or something trivial, but Jagmeet Singh's facing another round of what are you doing? Because he does send a lot of fundraising emails, but I guess they're not working.
Yeah, definitely not as well as the conservative ones who've really nailed down that how to get $20 out of the same people week after week.
It's a lot easier to generate like the conservative outrage than I guess the New Democrat, or maybe just their base isn't as deep pocketed. But an idea that would put more money in everyone's pockets just became a little less likely as Doug Ford decided, contrary to his promise, to completely cancel the province's basic income pilot project.
Yeah, it's not exactly a surprise. I mean, he did promise not to do it, but this was always one of those promises that were likely to be broken.
So Ontario had been running a trial where they picked a town and was giving, I think, half the people or everyone in that town something like $20,000 or $30,000 a year as a way to see what the effects of that would be on various health measures. This followed the similarly aborted Mincome project that happened in Dauphin, Manitoba in the 70s, which was also killed when a progressive conservative government came in, that time at the federal level. We managed to get data out of that 40 years later and discovered it was actually working really well in terms of people not going to hospital and spending time on what they actually needed and not just not working. So it's a bit disappointing to see Doug Ford kill an experiment midway through. It kind of just throws the money away.
I wonder how many people are affected by that, especially since some of those people are probably being retrained or finding ways to learn new techniques or new employment skills. And so by taking this funding away, you're effectively putting people back in poverty situations and not getting the training that they could otherwise be getting to have themselves become self-sustaining.
Or putting new people in poverty situations because someone who had, not a great job, but something that was paying the bills, who may have wanted to improve their skills, may have quit that stable job to go to school on the promise from the government. And that promise, that commitment to sort of fund you for a year as part of this experiment is now broken. And that person's like, well, I'm hung out to dry.
Yeah, that could definitely be an issue. Probably numbers aren't super available on how many there are, but yeah, it's definitely going to cause problems. And I think we'll see a lot of people who did kind of change up their life situation a bit, and because they gave them an opportunity to do something different. So yeah, not a great move all around.
There's a BC tie-in here because one of the parts of the BC Green, BC NDP confidence and supply agreement was to run a basic income test project here. And a lot of people said, well, that makes no sense because we should just wait until the Ontario one is done, because they actually started work on it a couple months ago and they hired friend of the pod, Lindsay Tedds, as the head of that study.
It's going to be a real habit with the provincial government cuts something off before it's finished.
Well, but it does mean that her working group, their research is now more important, and it's actually good they started early. I did reach out to her on Twitter to see what she thought of the news, or what it meant to her work, and she suggested that, they will try to get what little data there is so far from the Ontario project, and I think they'd already been working together, and so hopefully they can pull some value out of that and move towards creating a recommendation for what a pilot project would look like in BC. I think the other part of this is in Ontario, they also at the same time announced that they would be cancelling an increase to some of the welfare rates. But Doug Ford did say he's giving 100 days to reform their income support system, which was probably long overdue. Or when I looked at Ted's timeline about that, she called that a bit short to try to totally reform a welfare system. So good news out of Ontario.
Oh, the other things Doug Ford's been targeting is the carbon tax, and we got some news out of Ottawa that the Liberals are going to be making some tweaks to it, specifically around concerns over competitiveness, and they're going to change the point at which big emitters have to start paying the carbon tax.
There was this claimed fear, and it's kind of inevitable in, I'll say, neoliberal approach to things, that you end up with this race to the bottom. And when you have Trump with the foot on the accelerator off the cliff, well, we have to follow or else business will flee there.
The neoliberals are generally pretty on board with the carbon tax stuff.
Well, some of them. The economists and the ones who actually accept climate change. Maybe the neoconservatives aren't. The issue here, though, is that the U.S. is making no efforts on climate change, and therefore their manufacturing sectors will be more profitable than ours because they don't have to worry about the shit they're putting into the atmosphere. Where our steel, iron, cement factories will have to worry. So the federal government's carbon plan was always confusing, and I don't think any of us actually paid attention to it much because we have our own carbon tax here in BC, and so the federal government's plan won't apply to us, and it won't apply to Alberta, who's brought in their own carbon tax.
Although that may change in a year.
Maybe. And it wasn't going to apply to Ontario, who was bringing in a cap and trade system. Well, Doug Ford has deleted that and is launching a lawsuit against this federal plan along with Saskatchewan and other provinces, but the part of the Liberal plan that's changed is they'd essentially said in those provinces that don't have their own tax or system, we will apply our federal tax to them. And reading the details, it's actually weird. They're not really applying it across the board. They were going to apply it to those manufacturers who were 70% above the average of their industry. So if you were in the top 30% of the emitters, you got hit by the tax until you came down. And now the government has said, well, that's only going to be the top 10%.
Which kind of undermines the point of having a carbon tax. If you're just going to only target the worst, you might cut out the most egregious polluters, but that still leaves, 90% of the polluters out there. And looking at some of the stuff listed on here, cement, that is not a low carbon product. The concrete industry puts out something like 5% of global CO2 emissions. It's not small, and only targeting the 10 worst percent of it still leaves a lot of emissions untouched.
So it's this, between this and Trudeau's moves to bring in more border security branding on some of the immigration issues, it seems like they're really trying to cut off the Conservatives at the pass by beating them at their own game. They're going to be, we're not Conservatives, but we get that you have legitimate concerns, so we're going to try to be half Conservatives, which never feels like a winning strategy, because the people who want real Conservatives are going to vote real Conservatives, and the people who wanted the Liberals to take strong action on climate and be a welcoming party to refugees are now going to feel sold out. So why?
I can't see this being something that Ontarians voted for when they got their first Green MPP elected in Guelph. That should have sent at least a relatively strong message saying we want environmental policies being implemented in Ontario. And we're just not seeing that now.
I don't think Doug Ford pays that much attention to one seat.
He's not going to pay attention to any seats, probably even within his own party. But that's Doug Ford. But I think you raised the point that even the federal Liberals did well in Ontario. And if Trudeau's only read of the Ontario election is, oh, Doug Ford won a majority, so we're in trouble there, don't know if that's smart politics.
No, especially because it's been conventional wisdom in Canada that the party in Queen's Park is going to be the different one than the party in Ottawa. Like, they just tend to switch back and forth, so it's not one of those things people should read too much into.
So it looks like more changes to the federal carbon tax regime may be coming before it's introduced. So we may need to get someone to help break this down in the near future. I know you were seeing a number of economists on Twitter weren't actually too bothered by this announcement.
Yeah, so maybe getting one of them on, because there's clearly, I think there's some nuance we're probably not getting on this, but it does seem concerning.
I'm sure we'll get tweets.
Yes, there's at least a few economists who listen to us, so I'm sure we'll hear from them.
But other than that, we'll keep our eye on Ontario to see what next madness goes on there, see how many more, pretty much BC voters that Trudeau can piss off. Because I guess the one thing is these moves don't really affect the view of Liberals in BC since we already have a carbon tax. Although if they voted for a Trudeau government that would help bring standards across the country and those standards keep getting weaker, maybe it plays into that calculus.
I think it does undermine the kind of grand environmental bargain that was supposedly struck between we'll put in a carbon tax and build a pipeline. They're watering down one and pushing through the other. It does skew things a bit.
Yeah, and it makes them look like they're on the defensive the entire time. And so, I don't know, maybe their internal polling is really bad, and this is how they think they can win. We'll have to see in 2019.
And that has been Politos. Find links to the stories we mentioned in the show notes at politos.ca. Make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PolitosPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. Support the show and get early access to our interviews at patreon.com/Politos. And if you have ideas for the show, feel free to send to us. Thanks for listening.